Hi, welcome to session one of this new topic that we're starting titled The Idea of Progress in the Making of Modern America. We're looking at the late 19th century, and what we're going to be doing in this topic is looking at one of the most important, influential ideas in the United States that really shaped the way Americans were, on one hand, making sense of a series of changes that were taking place around them. This is a time, the late 19th century, when we're going to see the dawn of a new civilization, modern industrial civilization. The United States was modernizing very rapidly. It was building a modern economy, with industrial capitalism. There's, of course, an industrial revolution taking place. We're going to get there, of course, in due course when we talk about the specific social and economic changes that transpire in the late 19th century. Will be a topic, of course, that is going to come after this. But here, again, we're going to be looking again at how Americans were making sense of the rise of this new civilization. It was called modernity. Modern industrial America was born after the Civil War and Reconstruction. There were rapid, radical changes taking place in American society, and of course in different parts of the world as well, when modernity was now emerging, and also in places like Europe as well. We're going to see, of course, the rise of modern science, modern technology. There were many technological innovations. There was actually a technological revolution taking place in the late 19th century. That, again, brought a series of new tools that had never even been imagined, and perhaps some of them were imagined in the past, but those were considered to be almost like magical ideas, if you will, that are now materializing again in the new technologies born in the late 19th century. Just to give you an example, like electricity and the telephone, for example. Just imagine again how magical those innovations were for the peoples living during that time. So again, there were radical, dramatic changes taking place, of course, in the late 19th century, in the realm of economics as well. We're going to get there, of course, what, again, the changes were in very brief. But Americans, of course, will have to make sense of those changes and interpret them in a way that provided meaning, again, to their lives and meaning to the world at large, the world that they were living, to make sense of the kind of world that was emerging before their eyes and where they were going at the same time. And in that idea, again, that central idea that really was central in the thinking of Americans that provided meaning to what they were experiencing was the idea of progress. And once that idea was formulated, again, Americans really held very steadfast to that idea in order to not just provide meaning, but trying to attain progress in every area of human activity. Everything that they were doing, in other words, they tried to progress because they felt that this was the meaning, again, of human existence, that this was even a law of nature, that even nature is progressing. This is, again, something that is taking place in the universe and also in the world of human beings. And so, therefore, it was important to attain progress in everything that human beings were doing. And so, again, this is a topic that is going to deal primarily with the history of ideas, if you will, how Americans were thinking, in other words, how they were making sense of the changes taking place around them. And the central idea that we're going to actually analyze here is the idea of progress. Again, the idea of progress in the making of modern America. And let's go to our slide so we can now see, of course, how we're going to organize this topic, what are going to be the main components, how we're going to break it down, in other words. And so, again, this is the title, the idea of progress in the formation of modern America. We're talking about the latter decades, again, of the 19th century. So we can say the end of the Civil War is a good starting point, although there's no specific year that you can say, okay, so from this time onwards, the idea of progress is really starting, to become the dominant, concept, the dominant idea in the United States. It's pretty much at the end of the Civil War, we're going to see, of course, this idea being introduced, and it's going to be gaining momentum year by year, again, to the point that by the turn of the century, it had become so popular that even some of the largest popular movements in the United States that was really trying to bring about a whole new society, we're going to get there eventually, again, pretty much name the movement after progress, called the Progressive Era. The progressives really wanted to create a whole new society in which progress will be attained by all Americans. And so they were proposing a series of reforms and so on in the country. That's how important, that idea was, that even one of the most popular reform movements, popular political movements, again, and there's going to even be a third political party in the early 20th century named after progress, the Progressive Party, progressive politics, and so on and so forth. That's how, again, that's how important that term was in the United States, which was something that was emerging, if you will, in the minds of Americans more profoundly in the late 19th century. Again, this is like the age of progress, so to speak, okay? This is, progress was like the spirit of the age, if you will, when you look at the late 19th century, okay? One of the most important ideas that really influenced the way Americans thought about politics, about economics, about science, about technology, about the world of nature. You name it. Again, they saw progress everywhere. Okay, so this is just, again, pretty much explaining, why we're going to be looking at this. In other words, but now let's look at how we're going to break it down. How we're going to actually explain this topic by looking at the table of contents, and the table of contents, it's almost something that is going to be present in every topic. Again, is that I will present a table of contents, okay, that is like when you read a book, it tells you, the main chapters, for example. Okay, it has chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, but it has to have some form of introduction as well. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to present an introduction that is going to kind of present like the background, if you will, the historical background of progress. In other words, why is it, first and foremost, before we start talking about, again, the areas where Americans are going to be much influenced by this idea of progress, it's important to just look at the background. In other words, okay, so, when was the time when, for the first time, people, began to think about progress? Where, exactly this idea was coined? What were the circumstances, again, the times? What was really going on, during those times that led people to start thinking about this? Okay, but this idea of progress, of course, this is going to be a historical background that is going to look at the 17 and 1800s, because in those centuries, the 17 and 1800s were the centuries when this idea was first introduced in the writings of philosophers, historians, scientists, and so on. This is when, again, this idea became very popular, the 17 and 1800s, and it's not going to become the dominant idea in the United States until the late 19th century, the late 1800s, that is to say. So, again, first and foremost, an introduction, okay? an introduction so students can locate, okay, the scenery, the atmosphere, in other words, of those times from which those ideas, again, like the idea of progress, actually flourished. And once we clear that, then we're going to move into the main components of this topic by looking at three areas that Americans consider to be vital to invest and to devote energies and effort to attain the most progress as possible, because they believe that those areas were essential for creating this ideal society, this ideal existence for human beings, that is to say. And the first area, again, we're going to analyze, like the first chapter of a book, for example, again, is the scientific and technological revolutions. Again, science and technology was being revolutionized very dramatically in the 1700s, 1800s. We're going to see the rise of a new science, by the way, what we call today modern science. The science that we use today was born during those centuries. Okay, and we're going to see, of course, the context, the reasons why this science came into being, how it displaced the previous science that people used before, and how from this science we're going to see the innovations. Again, people are going to use scientific knowledge from their research in order to really create new technologies that are going to actually alter the way people live and work in very, very dramatic ways. Okay, so we're going to go through all the technologies that were invented back in the 19th century that are really are the seeds of the technologies of today. Modern technology, what we call modern technology, was born back in the 1800s and the 19th century, and we're going to see one by one the ones that were born again in the 19th century and how those technologies changed the way people live. Okay, so second, after we do that, we're going to look at progress in the realm of economics, economic progress, so to speak, by looking at the rise of capitalism. Okay, so there was a new economic system as well arising in the 1800s. That was capitalism. It was really revolutionary in that it was really changing the way people organized themselves to produce what needed to be produced. Okay, it was a new social organization. Okay, and it really revolutionized the way people live in general. Okay, so it was capitalism, an economic revolution as well. And we're going to look at that, and also how and why people interpret the rise of capitalism also as another area, as you know, in which now humans have the opportunity to progress economically, to improve their lives, etc. Again, this is something that, again, Americans were thinking back then, again, looking at capitalism, again, as another area where, you know, progress was taking place, that there was progress, you know, taking place in the economy and so on. And again, this is going to be another area where people are going to consider essential to attain progress, okay, economically. Okay, and number three, the third key term we're going to look at, of course, is the theory of evolution. This is a scientific theory introduced in the 1850s by a British biologist who proposed that progress was taking place in the world of nature. Okay, it's not just that humans are progressing their systems of knowledge, their tools, their technologies, and their economic systems, but what this theory suggests, the theory of evolution, is that nature, period, that one of the laws of nature, you know, is actually improving every life form, you know, on the planet. Everything that is alive, from a cell to, you know, an insect, an animal, a plant, a tree, you know, a human being, that is improving over time, in other words. And so, of course, this is going to influence Americans, you know. in the way they're going to interpret, of course, progress in the realm of capitalism, for example, in the realm of science and technology, because they said, oh, so progress is not just something that we are doing in our society, we human beings, but this is also something that nature is doing as well. It's part of a natural mechanism, it's a natural law that everything progresses over time, everything that is alive. So we're not really doing anything different from nature. We're just simply in harmony with natural law, because we're really, in tune with the natural law of improvement, of progress as well. So the theory of evolution simply came to confirm, the idea of progress in the United States when Americans were trying to progress in terms of wages, in terms of investment or economic well-being status, or when they were trying to come up with more and more technologies, etc. Because they said this is what, again, nature is doing anyway. So again, we're going to look at the theory of evolution again much later, but those are the three main components that we're going to look at in this topic, and each one of them are going to be key terms that are going to be on the exam. So keep this in mind, that the first exam is going to have a topic from which I'm going to extract key terms. So if you're wondering which is that topic, this is the topic. Okay, this is the topic from which I'm going to extract a series of key terms, and you'll be asked to answer them, of course. The other topics that we're covering are going to have questions, and only one topic will be selected for you to answer the questions of, and from this topic you're going to have to answer the key terms, that is to say. So again, I'll remind you once we get towards the end of this. Okay, so now of course I told you about that, we're really looking at the introduction, historical background here. Okay, looking at the historical background to the age of progress as a general introduction, that is to say, looking at, again, the background, for example, of the 17 and 1800s, just understanding why during that time this concept, progress, came to the surface, if you will, of the minds of, let's say, Americans, but also, as we'll see, came to the surface first in the minds of Europeans, because this is actually, an idea that was first elaborated in Europe, and from Europe we're going to see that idea introduced in North America, in the United States, and elsewhere, by the way. But we're just simply going to focus here in the United States and how this idea is going to flourish first in Europe, and how the United States is also going to be part of that, again, that phenomenon. Okay, so this is just, again, an introduction, so you can understand, like, the background, in other words, from how the ideas of progress in terms of science, technology, and economics, and evolution, again, in biology, why is it that this idea flourished and became so important? In order to understand that, again, we have to go back to the times when we're going to see the first writings, the first ideas, the first discussions being presented, in which European philosophers, intellectual scientists are really now coining it and using it again in their discourses, in their presentations, in their teachings, and so on. It will become a very popular idea. So the background, again, the historical background, really, of the age of progress, or the idea of progress, again, goes back to Europe and the U.S., first starting in Europe, of course, in the 1800s, as a result of very dramatic and very profound changes that were taking place in both Europe and the US. Okay, so this idea did not just emerge in a vacuum. Okay, it's not just that suddenly people thought it was just fancy and began to ponder on that, but rather this is something that people developed after witnessing a series of very rapid, radical, profound changes that were taking place in their societies. So again, the outside, again, social, economic, technological changes taking place in a very rapid manner are going to actually cause people to start pondering on that. Again, there were new and transformative changes taking place in Europe and the United States, again, in those particular centuries, that convinced people that progress was real. So therefore, they're going to coin it. In other words, they're going to coin that terminology. And so, number one of the first new and transformative changes, again, that Europeans and later on Americans experienced, that convinced people that what they were actually witnessing was simply progress in the making, was that those centuries, the 17 and 1800s, starting in Europe and then moving into the United States, what we're going to see is the rise of a new civilization. Okay, a whole new civilization is on the rise, and it's a high-tech, in other words, a high-tech industrial civilization was born during this time. This is the civilization that we live in today, that we take so much for granted, of course. It's a high-tech world, again, in which technologies are advancing very rapidly. They play a key and fundamental role in our lives. Without those technologies, there's no way we can actually live the way we live, engage in the kind of work that we do, and so on. Our entire civilization is based on this type of technology, and it's also industrial in that industries, factories, and so on, are the ones that are actually manufacturing everything that is required, in society. Okay, everything that human beings need, for the most part, are actually processed or manufactured, made, again, in industries. Okay, as well as this industrial civilization. So in a nutshell, again, what those societies back then were witnessing, they were not really coining, this high-tech industrial civilization. This is something that we now see looking backwards. Hindsight is always 20/20. Okay, so when you look backwards in time, you're able to see clearly what happened in the past. But when you're going through it, you're not really, aware of what actually is happening in your own world. Even though your own world, it must be changing very dramatically. People just don't have specific terms to describe what they're going through. This is something that future generations will do. They're going to actually describe the changes that happened in the past. So yeah, we in hindsight, we can say this high-tech civilization was born back during the day. But in that time, when the civilization was on the rise in places like England and in the United States and also in Western Europe, France, Holland, Germany will be part of that as well during those centuries, is that people, what they were witnessing and aware of, is that they were witnessing the coming of the machine age. Okay, that's how they were able to describe the changes. In other words, that what they were really witnessing is the coming of machines. In other words, that they were, this high tech, in other words, industrialized civilization. They simply, what they were describing, what they were witnessing, that they could actually see is that for the first time in history, people had now arrived to the point that they were able to make machines to work for us, in other words. So that's what, again, the first industries back in those times were actually doing. The first factories, the first industries were places where there were machinery, there were machines that were producing products, in this case, clothing or agricultural tools or hardware, for example, back during this time, that something that, of course, people did by hand in the past. The people have to weave clothing by hand, or a blacksmith will have to make a tool, take a long time. But now those machines were, doing everything very, very fast, more effectively, more efficiently than by human labor. So the machines were now doing the work for us. Of course, humans are still operating the machine, but the machine can produce more and more products, more number of products, than it would be done by hand. Okay, so again, the machine age is simply the age in which now machines arise. They're now replacing human labor. Okay, they're the ones that are going to be producing everything for us, and there's going to be also machines that were invented for transportation purposes, like railroads, for example. And railroads are replacing the old method of transportation, inland transportation, in which people use animals, of course, and ox carts, and horses pulling carts, and so on and so forth. That now, forget about that. Now you got, again, railroads that are going to transport tons and tons of materials, whether we're talking about food or resources, raw materials, people. So, the possibilities are endless. And so you got machinery now, engaged in transportation. Those are the ones that doing, that work for animals. Instead of animal power, machines. So again, this is, a very profound, new, and transformative change that led people to think about progress, first and foremost. Why? Well, because the conclusion, again, of many scientists, intellectuals, again, philosophers, and so on, that were alive during this time, is that that this was a sign of progress. The coming of the machines, the coming of the industries, this high-tech world that was barely being born. They said, this is progress. This is what this is really the dawn of this new civilization that they simply describe as the machine age, for example. The age of the machines is that this was, again, a sign that we were moving forward very rapidly. Okay, that we're attaining progress. This is accelerating us into something new, because what they were actually, again, concluding is that progress, again, in scientific knowledge, they said, how we arrived here is because our scientists enable us to create, again, the machines, in other words. Okay, so what was actually used to create the machines and industries? Scientific knowledge. Again, so progress in scientific knowledge, what they concluded was that progress in scientific knowledge empowers human beings to overcome problems and even dominate nature. Okay, so this is their conclusion, in other words, that what they were witnessing is that we have arrived to a scientific system that was enable us to accumulate knowledge that was actually empowering people to overcome problems. Our science is coming up with new tools, new technologies. It's empowering us. We're inventing machines that are going to free people from labor eventually. So again, this is, not like the ideal, state in which the machines are doing all the work for human beings. That's not what they were actually suggesting, but that was going to happen, in the future. Look, we have invented machines to produce things for us very fast, very easy, and so on. And so how we got to this point is because, again, we developed, again, a scientific knowledge. We accumulated enough knowledge, in other words, about the world, about the elements, and so on, that we're able to produce those wondrous works like machines, again, that are very mysterious. They function in a very mysterious way, but they're working for us now, and it's very empowering because now we can overcome many of the problems of the past. We can free people from from labor, and perhaps we're going to actually free people from other problems as well. But this is a sign of progress. This is a sign of scientific progress. In other words, we are attaining a lot of progress scientifically because now we're developing new tools that are changing the way we work and the way we live as well. Okay, so again, the advent of the machine age was the very first, if you will, historical phenomenon, again, that opened up this, this conversation about progress. People said, why we got to this point is because our scientific progress. Again, this is a sign that we're in the right path. Okay, we have the right science. We need to be moving forward because, again, this is going to empower us, in other words, humans, to overcome problems, and why not, dominate nature as well. Okay, our machines are going to be, used to even dominate, the world of nature. People were actually romanticizing or fantasizing about that, even, in the 17 and 1800s. That the mad scientists, the genius that we're going to create again miraculous works of of technologies that are going to be so powerful, that we're going to pretty much even dominate, of course, nature, bring rain or do something that was impossible to do. That scientific knowledge was actually going to make that possible. In other words, so the advent of the high-tech industrial civilization pretty much opened up, okay, the very first avenue, the first, channel for people thinking about progress. They thought that was progress, in other words, okay. The other, of course, historical phenomenon, of the 17 and 1800s that also convinced people that progress was real, and that was actually the goal of human existence, by the way, was the rise of a new economic system that displaced a system that had governed human societies for not only hundreds of years, but even thousands of years, all over the planet, with very few exceptions. The vast majority of human societies lived under an economic system known as feudalism. Again, that was considered the old economic order. Okay, so under feudalism, wealth accumulation is not necessarily, the goal of human beings. In other words, because wealth itself is concentrated. What we call land and resources, etc., is really concentrated in just a handful of individuals or groups, such as the monarch or a chief. There's a village chief that very much is, has control of all the land, etc. Also, the landowners or the nobility, they're also part of, the land owning class, if you will. And they're given, of course, land by the king. The king actually gives land grants to individuals that are loyal to the king to oversee, of course, that land on the king's behalf. So they become part of the nobility or landowners, in other words. The church in Europe also was a landowner as well. Okay, so that's feudalism, and what happens is that the landowners, in this case, where there's the monarch, the nobility, or the church, under feudalism, the idea is that all they're doing is simply offering protection to the general population. Okay, so the rest of society has to be protected. Okay, guys, in the past, protection was vital. Okay, perhaps that was the most important concern of human societies in the past. People needed a protector, in other words, a strong man, somebody to protect them. And so the nobility, the monarchy, and the church were simply, again, protecting people. And in order to compensate for that protection, to pay, in other words, for that service of protection, the people living in the land of the monarchy, church, or nobility had to pay tribute. In other words, you have to share a certain percentage of what you're producing to the landowner as a form of payment. Again, you're paying for your protection. In other words, that's called tribute. All right. If you're a farmer, you share a certain percentage of your produce. If you're an artisan, a certain percentage of your gains. If you're selling, of course, your artwork and so on. So if you're a merchant, likewise, you share a certain percentage of your earnings, what you're selling as well, and so on. That's tribute. You're simply paying for that protection to the landowner. So wealth accumulation per se, that you can actually generate wealth and build, again, fortunes, was very difficult because, again, all wealth was concentrated and passed on, by the land-owning class. Okay, that land that they control, the king, the monarchy, and the nobility, and the church will simply inherit, pass on again those entitlements to their descendants. So it was very difficult, to gain access to those resources. That was feudalism. But we're going to see, of course, in the 1700s, the introduction of a new system in England. England is going to be the home of a whole new economic system that is going to change and alter the way people actually live and work, and introduce the possibility of actually owning, of course, property. Okay, and that happened, of course, in England after a series of merchants challenged the king because what they were, petitioning was for the English king to reform the laws of England to allow people to own property. What merchants wanted is private ownership of property, okay, to own property, that is to say. And they wanted their investments, their ships, their warehouses, their stores, and so on, to be theirs, and under feudalism, that was, is really ultimately the king's property, everything that is within the kingdom. So again, there was a bloody war fought between the merchants and the monarchy in England in the 1600s. Inevitably, the king was defeated, the monarchy, and we're going to see the merchants, of course, seizing now the control of England and the state, and they introduced new reforms. They reformed the law of the land in England in a way that it introduced capitalism. Okay, the reforms brought about by the merchant class of England that were now in control of the English Parliament, which was considered like the seat of government in England. It brought about capitalism. By the 1700s, we're going to see England now moving, towards capitalism. And how England moved towards capitalism again is by the introduction of private property. Again, this is a right, one of the rights of the new English Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, is that people can now own property. You can buy land or resources. And the idea is not just for you to own it, but under capitalism, the idea is that you are now freed, if you will, in the economy, not only to own the property, but to use that property to build wealth. Again, so capitalism is very much centered in wealth creation, okay, and building wealth, that is to say. So the idea is that you also have to allow people to open up a business or an enterprise, which is called free enterprise. Okay, capitalism also brought this idea of free enterprise. Look, you're free to open up any business you want. Again, you're pretty much set free in the economy and so on, so you can pursue your own interest, and you can actually, not only buy the land, but use that land to, build wealth. You can move in sheep, for example, and sell wool, or you can go grow crops for the market. You can sell crops and so on. You can make money, in other words, or you can buy a little piece of property so you can open up a shop or a bakery, etc. You can build wealth. You can make money, in other words. It's a money making, if you will, type of system. Capitalism. That allows people to accumulate and build wealth, but in this case, not just a handful of landowners like in feudalism, but pretty much the general population. And of course, those changes, private property and free enterprise, inevitably led to the rise of the middle class, again, because there will be significant numbers of people in England that are going to take the opportunity to invest, make investments in terms of buying good land and using the land for different types of enterprises. We're going to see the coming of factories and industries, shops, and so on. And eventually, this is going to create a whole new class, okay? A whole new class of people, a new social class, and that is the middle class again. Shopkeepers, business owners, and so on, that were part of this new class of entrepreneurs and so on, again, in England. So this is, again, very important change, taking place starting in England, but capitalism is going to spread also in the United States in the 1800s as well. It's going to spread also into other places of Europe. I mentioned, France, Holland, and Germany, for example, are going to also move towards capitalism in the 1800s. And we're going to see now a whole new system that is bringing about significant radical change in the way people live and in the way people work as well. And of course, the rise of capitalism also was part of this background from which the idea of progress flourished, because what people were witnessing, was that it was possible, for individuals, for people to actually improve their economic standing, their economic well-being. It was possible that to build wealth, and by building wealth, in other words, people were actually living better, in other words. Okay, so what people witness is that economic progress, those that were attaining progress economically, were people that lived more secure, okay, more prosperous. They have a sense of well-being, and they were individuals that showed, that live very happy. So economic progress, they said, brings security, prosperity, well-being, and happiness. So again, this is another issue again, that capitalism is going to convince people, again, that economic progress was pretty much the goal of human existence. If you wanted security, prosperity, well-being, and happiness, in other words, okay? That's another thing. So it was not just the coming of the machines and this high-tech world, but it's also, again, the improvement, again, of economic conditions for millions of people, again, in Western Europe and in the United States as well. And another issue, again, that also we're going to look at, again, in this topic is, when we move into the third part, by the way, is another issue that also convinced Europeans and Americans that progress was also real, okay, was great discoveries, great revelations of the Earth's history, the history of the Earth, in other words, okay. During the 1700s and 1800s, we're going to see the revelations of fossils. Those are the remnants, the remains of bone structures of creatures that were totally unknown to people living in this time. Again, there was a hidden history, so to speak, of the history of the Earth that people had no knowledge of, that when suddenly those fossils, those remnants came to the surface, came to light, for people to witness again. This is going to be very, very shocking, to say the least. But this is going to also, as we'll see, convince a great number of people that progress was also taking place in the world of nature as well. So what we're talking about here is, again, the prehistoric organisms, that roam the earth. For example, the dinosaurs. For the first time, we're seeing again skeletons and unearthed, all over Europe, for example, about dinosaurs, and also what appears to be human-like creatures, humanoids. They look very much like humans, but they differ in terms of their bone structures and so on, or skull sizes, etc. But this is something that was totally unknown, for humanity. And so this is another, very important new and transformative change occurring during this time that convinced people that progress was also taking place in the world of nature, since what they believed is that all of living organisms, that everything that is alive has gone through a process of change. In other words, that when you look, for example, those dinosaurs, they said, look, what happened to the dinosaurs? What happened to those creatures that are no longer around? So there's going to be, of course, scientific theories that will propose that what actually happened is that many of the organisms that died off and become extinct were simply organisms that could not adapt and survive. Okay, so nature makes sure that those organisms that are weak and cannot adapt and survive face off, become extinct, in order to allow organisms that are stronger and fitter to actually make it and survive. And again, this is what scientists were actually proposing, by the way. The theory of evolution, again, is going to be much centered on this idea of the survival of the fittest, in other words. So people were simply saying, look, progress is even taking place in the world of nature, because all living organisms have grown stronger and fitter over time, and those that couldn't survive are simply now buried. We can see them, they couldn't make it. So we are now the survival of the fittest. All the organisms that are in the earth right now are simply the survival of the fittest. So even progress, again, is taking place in the world of nature. It's one of the laws, again, of nature. So consider this as simply a general introduction, again, to this topic that is just giving you an idea of the most important and dramatic changes that occurred in those particular centuries that gave birth to this idea of progress, and why this idea is going to become central to the thinking, not only of Americans, but also of Europeans alike, because they were sharing similar experiences in terms of, again, seeing the birth of machines and high technologies and so on, a new economic system allowing people to, move upward in the ladder. And of course, now new revelations about the Earth history, pretty much, suggesting that organisms can actually become extinct and die, because that's the law of nature. In other words, nature is about progress, it's improvement, and those that cannot keep up with that progress, become extinct. In other words, so now let's move into the actual sections of this topic that are now going to break down. Is going to just now delve deeper, step by step, into the three areas where Americans were convinced that progress, on one hand, was taking place, but also should continue to take place if we were to build, again, this new civilization, this very advanced world that was imminent. It would be something that awaits us in the future, this futuristic world in which technology will save us. It will do all the work for us. Life for humans is going to be magical because we're going to be so knowledgeable and so technologically advanced that we're going to reach like a sort of kind of paradise again on Earth. Those were the kind of projections again that people had, not only back then in the 19th century, but across the 20th century, even all the way to today. We still project the future to be far more advanced, although sometimes we tend to think that we really need to change certain things that we're doing right now if we're going to make it there, in other words. So there's a lot of warnings that we perhaps are deviating or not going in the right path, of course. But for the most part, there's a deep faith, very strong faith that we place again in science and technology as to be essential, so vital again in the construction of a better world. Again, so this is exactly what we're going to be doing in the very first part. Part one is going to look at science and technology in terms of the background of progress by looking at the scientific and technological revolutions that happened during the 17 and 1800s. Just a second. All right. All right. So to move forward now, it is very important again that if we are to talk about the scientific revolution and the technological revolution that swept across Europe and the United States across those centuries, that is going to really revolutionize the way people think and also live. This is something that we're going to actually be analyzing here. Again, not just, looking at the new technologies, that we're going to look at the technological revolution, but also how those new technologies were actually changing the way people live, work, and socialize as well. Technologies change everything that human beings, everything that we do, how we live, how we think, how we interact with one another. So we're going to actually look at that as well. Okay, so before we look at the new science, the advent of this new science, because we're talking about a revolution. When we're talking about scientific revolution, we're talking about the introduction of a scientific system that proposed to study the world in a specific way that overthrew or discarded another one entirely. That's when we're talking about revolutions. Again, we have to be very clear that we're talking about in a revolution, what happens is that there's one system discarding or overthrowing completely another and replacing it, with, instead. Okay. There's economic revolutions, there's political revolutions, there's scientific revolutions, of course. One way of looking at reality and studying reality was replaced entirely by another. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing here. Again, initially is looking at the scientific revolution, again, that brought us modern science, the science that we use today. The science that we use today was born back in the 17 and 1800s. By the late 1800s, by the late 19th century, it had become the established mainstream science in the United States and in Europe, to the point that education systems, colleges, universities, scientific communities had to follow the principles, the guidelines of the new science. You could no longer, use the old one, in order to make any claims, in other words. And this is the science that was taught, to the, future generations. And by the late 19th century, there was really, again, the mainstream science. So to understand this revolution, the advent of this new science, in the 17 and 1800s. We have to understand the science that came before. In other words, okay, just like we just briefly explained, for example, feudalism and how capitalism replaced it. Okay, that was just a very general picture, if you will. It's true, but we also have to paint a certain picture again of the old science, just to understand how people made sense of reality, how people actually studied the world and explained what happened in the world, and how this science was totally overthrown, so to speak, by this new modern science that came into being, okay, in the 17 and 1800s. Okay, so we can have a very clear comparison of the science of old, and the science that actually came later, in other words, like a compare and contrast, in other words. Okay, all right, so understanding the old science. Okay, so let us first understand the old science. Okay, this is the science that dominated the thinking, the studies, the research, if you will, scientists worldwide. So not only in Europe, okay, was this science dominant, but when we're talking about the old science that came before modern science, it is very important to note that all over the planet, okay, people use very similar scientific principles to understand reality and understand how the world works. Of course, there were differences. I'm not suggesting that what the science in Europe was identical to the science in Africa or Asia. There were variations, but there were certain fundamental ideas that were shared in common worldwide, in the old science. In what way? Well, all over the world, for hundreds and thousands of years, people use a scientific system that was actually based in religion, okay, all over the world. So this is one commonality. All over the world, what people call science was a science that relied heavily on religious and spiritual explanations and spiritual principles to understand, for example, the creation of the world. Everywhere you go around the world in the old science, people explain that the creation of the world, okay, occurred when the divinity, the divine, whether it's one God or a series of gods, assembled in order to form the universe. Okay, so this is why I'm actually, again, presenting here that the old science was religious based. It was a religious scientific system. So science and religion in the old science were one and the same. They were unified. Okay, they were not separated as they are today. When we talk about, for example, science, is totally independent and separated from the field of religion. And in fact, they're not just separated today, they're in many cases in conflict, okay, with each other. Science and religion today, they're in conflict in our world today. And this is because, as we will explain, of course, modern science is going to propose a whole new way of looking at reality and explaining it, of course, how it works. That is not going to include religion, of course, or spirituality. So first and foremost, understand that the old science, again, was not only, and again, we're not just talking about Europe, all over the globe, all human civilizations, societies, cultures worldwide, again, use similar principles in which the scientific thought, scientific systems were not separated from religious thought. Okay, because the idea, again, is that the world, again, the universe was created by the divine, first and foremost. Okay, there's a maker or makers, okay, they're creators or a single creator, doesn't matter, okay, that form the universe. But another issue, again, that was widely shared worldwide, yeah, by all cultures and so on, regarding the old science, is that the divine, okay, God or the goddesses or the spirits that build the universe were not necessarily separated from creation. In the old science, okay, the natural world that we live in and the supernatural world of divine spirits, gods, goddesses, and so on, angels, and so on, were not removed and separated from the natural world. They were part of it. Okay? So there was a unity, again, in the world of nature and the world of spirits. Spirit and matter were intertwined. Okay? They were intertwined. In other words, spirits lived in nature. Okay? Angels were here, for example. There were spirits. People believe, that some of them are good, some of them are bad. Okay? There's angels, there's demons, or etc. Again, and they live again in the world. Okay, and it's not just that, but they're the cause of everything. Okay, so everything that happens in the world of nature, okay, everything, from rain, for example, earthquakes or volcanoes, etc., you name it, the movements of the heavenly bodies, when you see the movement of the moon and the planets, etc., everything that moves or produces in nature to act in any way, okay, anything that happens in the world of nature is caused by spirits as well. Okay, so for every natural occurrence, okay, for every natural event, there is a spiritual explanation for it. Okay, there's a spiritual explanation. In other words, there's, for example, it was common in Europe to attribute earthquakes to the wrath of God. Okay, the wrath of God. There's an earthquake and a lot of people die. There's a lot of destruction, of course, and people fear those events because they felt that this was God angry at them. Okay, God is angry, shook the earth, and why? Well, because there was maybe we're sinning or we're not going to church, etc. We're disobeying the commandments and so on. God is angry. We're divine punishment, that is to say. Okay, those were the typical explanations, and there was always a spiritual religious explanation because this is what the science was actually saying, by the way. Okay, this is important because the scientists in the old science, in many cases, in the vast majority of the cases, were actually religious figures. That's how united, again, science and religion was in the old science. Before modern science, the scientists were in Europe, like the bishops, the priests, for example, monks in monasteries. They were the ones that were studying, mathematics, or they were the ones studying, astronomy and so on, looking at telescopes and looking at, Mars, etc. They were part of the church because they were the people of knowledge, and the science of old understood that everything that happened in the universe was produced by God or the angels, etc. Spiritual forces, in other words. So every explanation, okay, for any natural event, okay, even in the world of human beings, what happens to humans, everything was attributed again to spirits. Rain, for example, why does it rain? Okay, well, it rains because God is blessing us. Because when it rains, God, fertility, there's more food, there's more production, and food is life. So therefore, the conclusion, of course, is this is a blessing. In other societies around the world, they believe in the rain god. Okay, in Africa, Native Americans and so on, they pray to the rain god. to bring rain, bring spirits like the clouds and the wind and the thunder, and brings rain. So how do you bring rain in the old science? Well, you have to do a ritual, like a mass. Bring the priest, offer a mass, for rain, and so on. That was the technology. How you actually work with nature and make everything possible. Well, ritual. You have to appeal to the spiritual force or being that is responsible for rain. Native Americans pray to the rain god. They created a ceremony called the rain-making ceremony, to bring rain. That was the technology. Okay, you ask the rain god to bring rain. You negotiate with the rain god and so on. You present offerings and so on. And again, that was the technology back then. Okay, ritual. Okay, ritual was the technology. So first and foremost, the explanation is religious for everything that happens, and the solution is also religious. Okay, the explanation of why it rains is, the rain god brings the rain. And how do you bring rain? What is the solution? Again, if you want rain, it's also religious. You have to do a ritual, a ceremony, and so on. Again, so you can just apply this to everything, again, that people studied or people experienced, and this is how people thought. Scientifically, people thought always in terms of religion, in terms of spirits actually causing that. Of course, even sickness, and disease, even in Europe, was considered to be the influence of evil spirits. Now, somebody suffering from illness, back in Europe, the scientists, the doctors that studied in universities in the 15 and 1600s were still convinced that one of the reasons why somebody fell ill was because that person was absorbed an evil spirit, and the evil spirit dwelled in the place where that illness was located. And how do you actually bring it out from the body? They believed is through bloodletting, letting blood. In other words, cutting, one of the veins, a small cut, letting some blood out, in order for that, spirit to find an exit point to come out again of the body. And those were actual, surgeries performed in hospitals in Europe, in Paris, in London. Again, you're going to find that again being taught in medical schools. This is what doctors were learning in universities. You wanted to become a doctor, that was the old science. And it was practiced, it was considered to be knowledge, in other words. And so, again, somebody, for example, a human being that had seizures or had mood swings, had certain mental problems, was considered to be possessed. That was the scientific explanation is, well, that person has to be possessed either by a spirit or demon. And that's the explanation. What is the solution? You have to perform an exorcism, a ritual. In other words, solution, the technology is also ritualistic. Send them to the priest, to do some form of, ceremony, or a series of ceremonies to expel the spirit, and so on. Again, this is the old science. Nature was controlled by spirits because they live inside of nature. Okay, there's no separation between the spiritual world and the natural world. They're intertwined, and so therefore, this is how people actually went about studying the world and understanding it. And like I said, despite the fact that different societies and cultures and civilizations worldwide had different, so to speak, scientific systems, there were certain commonalities, and those commonalities I just explained. They have shared ideas, in which they use religion, of course, to explain everything. Okay. All right, so now that we understand the old science, okay, Now, let's move forward to understand the process of the scientific revolution that brought us modern science. Okay, so you're gonna see and understand the difference between one science and the other, and why exactly it was called a revolution. It was actually a scientific revolution. In a nutshell, what we're going to see here is the birth of a new science. As we move into the 17 and 1800s, this is what we're going to see. Okay, the replacement of one way or system of thought that made sense of reality with another one entirely. This is what in science is called a paradigm shift. Okay, a paradigm shift is a term used among scientists whenever there is a scientific revolution in which one version of reality, okay, is replaced entirely by another version of reality, completely. So in a scientific revolution, there's no like tweaking, there's no like minor changes or reforms being made to a science. There's the entire replacement of how people see reality with another, So that's what a paradigm is. A paradigm is a version of reality. So when there's a paradigm shift, is when you're actually replacing one version of reality for another. And how this process actually happened again is when there was specifically again one scientist that was really accredited for introducing this new version of reality and how to study it. He was going to be the one, be the father, if you will, of modern science. He's going to come in and pretty much suggest that the way to study the world is not by considering spiritual forces, for example, or entities that live in nature that are actually doing and moving everything, in the world of nature. But rather, what this scientist suggested is that the world of nature and ultimately reality itself was just material. That this was just a material reality. So this is what the shift was. The shift was that one version of reality rooted in religion was replaced by another one simply seen as materialistic. So modern science, the science of today, is very materialistic in that it only studies and takes into account matter and tries to explain everything that happens through material explanations, gathering material facts made by observations, that is to say. So it's very materialistic, that it only sees matter in the world and nothing else. Okay? And that scientist was Isaac Newton. He was the British physicist, mathematician who lived in the late 1600s, early 1700s in England, who is the father of modern science. When he introduced a whole new, paradigm to study reality, to study the world of nature, in which what he said is that first and foremost that reality is material. In other words, the world of nature is made up of physical objects, and everything is made up of matter. In other words, that the world is just simply material. Now, this is not to say that he was an atheist that did not believe in God. Again, he actually believed in God, but the way he explained, the universe is that he proposed that yes, indeed, there was a creator. He made the universe, in the beginning of time, etc. But he made it out of matter, first and foremost, and he made it in a way to function like a machine. In other words, okay, like a clockmaker. Okay, For example, there's somebody that's going to make a clock. Okay, there's a maker, of course, that made the clock, and there's just so many different tiny parts that are going to be moved, again, moving one another in synchronicity, in a way that is going to function in a very orderly manner. So it's going to have the seconds, it's going to have the minutes and the hours moving in a very exact way. So the clock maker built the clock, made it, and programmed the clock to function in a very precise way. And after the clockmaker made it, it just left the clock to function on its own mechanically. That's how he interpreted, again, the universe. That this universe was like a gigantic machine, like a gigantic clock. Okay, that everything happens very orderly, and mathematically as well. That God actually made it, in that fashion. But after God, made the universe, he went to another realm, totally far removed and disconnected from the universe. And the universe was simply functioning automatically by the laws of nature. Those are the mechanisms, in other words. The mechanisms of nature are simply the laws of nature. Natural law, what is called natural law, in other words. So this is what is called the mechanical worldview. It's materialistic, and the world functions mechanically. Okay, there's a mechanism for everything. There's a mechanism for rain. There's a mechanism for sickness. There's a mechanism that produces earthquakes. There's another natural mechanism that produces volcanoes and eclipses and everything else. Okay, that's, again, the basis of modern science. Modern science is very, very, materialistic. And so what this science is going to introduce that radically differed from the old science. Okay, so this is very important, and it's not just that. Okay, so this is what Newton proposed, but we have to understand some of the principles of this new science that were revolutionary, that altered the way people studied the world before in the old science. Okay, so the two most important principles, again, of this new science that were radically different, that were introducing something new, is number one, secularism. Modern science, the science of Isaac Newton that we use today, introduce, again, the idea of secularism. And secularism is simply just what I said a moment ago. And the idea that reality is material, that this world, this natural world, again, that we experience is strictly material, and that the spiritual world, again, is totally independent, far removed, and cut off from this one, existing in another separate world, in another realm. Okay, let's just say that. Okay, that has no influence in this one. So this is what Isaac Newton is saying. This is not what I'm saying. I offer a disclaimer here that does not reflect my own thoughts or ideas about science or reality or the universe or anything like that. Again, I'm just explaining how people used to study the world, before the coming of modern science, and what modern science actually, introduced that radically differed from the way that people actually, thought in the past. And so, again, modern science introduced, again, this idea of secularism, that the spiritual and the material worlds were totally independent, and that the material world that we live in today operate under a different set of laws, in other words, called natural laws, the laws of nature, in other words, that are independent from the spirits, that, that what happens in this world happens because there's a mechanism that makes it happen, not because there's a spirit or an entity that is making it happen, in other words. Okay, that is, again, the idea of secularism, the reality, this natural world that's just being material. And that, of course, what he was suggesting is that all we need to be concerned of is this particular world, the here and the now. This is, again, something that secularism actually, again, differs from the old science, in that the old science was very much concerned with the afterlife, the world after, like the heaven, for example. People were always concerned about not this life, not the here and the now. In the old science, people were concerned about going to heaven, ending suffering and so on. But what Newton is saying is that, well, what that might be, important, this world is also, important. This world, the here and the now, is also important. The here and the now must be understood. This physical existence, this physical planet, has to be studied. We have to study the laws of nature. We have to discover them, how that, this gigantic clock actually works. And we have to take care of it as well. So yeah, you can be concerned about the afterlife and think about it, of course, but this world is also extremely important as well. We're here for a reason, he said, and the reason is, to take care of this physical existence, make the most of it, and learn from it. In other words, how it works. And number two, the other, of course, issue that the science introduced was the idea of the scientific method. This is different from the method of the old science. In other words, what Newton is saying is that there's going to be a method for discovering the laws of nature. How do we know? How do we gather knowledge? How do we discover the law of rain? How do we discover the law of volcanoes and everything else? How do we go about doing that? In other words, what is the method of inquiry? In other words, so the method of inquiry that Newton is proposing is called empiricism or positivism. In other words, what Newton is suggesting, again, in this method called empiricism, is that the method for knowing, inquiring, and gathering knowledge about how this world works is through experience. That you have to detect everything that you're studying with your five senses. You have to be able to see it, to grasp it, to measure it, to weight it. You have to actually, in other words, not just imagine something, but actually, experience it, in other words. Okay, so you can no longer say, last night I dreamed about, somebody teaching me about how, why there's rain, or how to make a medicine or something like that. Like, no. What Newton is saying is that, no, you have to do research in the real world. You have to see the elements, the properties under a microscope, etc. Whatever you're doing, you have to witness, okay, that which what you're studying, and gather facts, in other words. So you have to make observations, and time and time again. And if you continue to make those observations and get the same results, and others can come in and verify with their senses what you're saying to be true, then you can actually say, this is now, a theory, or this is a statement that says this is how it works, of course. So you have to be positive. Okay, that's why it's called positivism. Positive means that you have to gather facts. You have to gather evidence, material evidence, to propose anything. Why we get sick, or, why, there's a hurricane, etc. So you have to gather facts that can explain this materially. Okay, you have to, prove everything materially. That is to say, you have to gather material observations, and that others can also see, in order for it to be real. This is important because all across the globe, of course, there's still, even today, societies that don't learn necessarily or exclusively through physical experience, the way modern science informs us. There's indigenous societies, for example, that in which certain medical doctors, that practice, for example, the art of healing, religious healing. They know the knowledge of herbs to cure disease and so on. What they claim is that the way they learn is through dreams, that for years and years and years, their ancestors visited them in dreams to teach them about plants, the medicinal properties of plants and so on and so forth. They rely on visions, dreams, or inspiration, intuition for knowing. And that's not, something material. This is something more internal. So this is, again, I want you to understand how important this is, because, again, other societies around the world, again, learn different or know in a different way, not necessarily in a lab, in which everybody is observing, under a microscope, etc., what's really going on beneath, but rather that there's other cultures that know, also how the world works in other ways as well. So we're going to make a stop here, because we have reached our time now. But when we come back, we continue looking at, very briefly, at the scientific revolution, just a few minutes, and then moving into the technological revolution and looking at also at the rise of capitalism. Everything when we come back in session 2. Okay, this is all I have for you, and I'll see you then again in our next session. Thank you.